Our guest in this segment, Dr. Stephen A. Goldman, frequent guest on the program, avid consumer of history, and he is a psychiatrist as well, doctor of psychiatry.
You're muted.
Not any longer.
Okay.
And has done a lot of work with veterans, soldiers, and written about history of it as well, too. Steve, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Pleasure is ours. You're going to be at Monocacy Battlefield soon.
Yes, very excited. I'll be speaking on both days. That is Saturday, July 12th, and Sunday, July 13th, at the 161st anniversary of the Battle of Monocacy.
Yeah, so what will your subject matter be there?
Apropos of what we discussed the last time, and Bill in particular for you, I'm unveiling a brand new talk, and as all three of you know, I love the backstory, and this is going to focus on something that I know the three of you are very interested in, and others are too, and that's the human element. One of the concerns I have about the portrayal of military history is the over-reliance, I think, for some folks to talk just about the military or strategic aspects, and you lose the human element. And no battle is more representative of the human element than the Battle of Monocacy. So what I'm going to focus on is the remarkable relationship between two of the most important commanders on the field, one of them being Lew Wallace, who was in Supreme Command of the 8th Corps, and the other troops that were involved in the battle, and another commander who I don't think many people are familiar with, but hopefully you will be after my talk, is Lieutenant Colonel David Clendenin, the commander of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and who literally showed up out of nowhere and was not in Wallace's command. And it's quite a story because it has a lot of elements that the three of us have talked about before, that in the midst of war and the fog of war, still the character of the people involved, the leadership involved, and the experience of becoming a soldier is in many cases paramount. And again, Monocacy is one of the greatest examples of that.
Bill?
Yeah. I'd like to hear more about the human element, but we talked in the last segment about Antietam, and they had for several years a candlelight tour, and that candlelight tour did just what you're describing now, Steve. It was looking at the human element. Very little of the battle, or none of the battle strategy was ever mentioned. It was the impact upon the town of Antietam, or the community of Antietam rather, and the families, and very little of the soldiers themselves. This is missing. You're bringing it to the forefront, and I very much appreciate it. But when you go to these battlefields, you don't find very much of this anymore, and I was very disappointed that Antietam no longer does this.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was an ex officio member of the committee that put together the brand new, well, no longer brand new, but the new visitor center at Gettysburg. And one of the things that we tried very hard was to address that. And exactly the kind of things you're talking about, the impact on the civilians, the fact that in all cases, whether it was Antietam or Gettysburg and Monocacy, they became hospitals after the battle, for weeks after that. And for example, there's a great portrayal of that at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg about the treatment of the wounded, both Confederate and Union, after the battles. So, as you know, there's a whole new scholarship on this, and there's a whole new emphasis on this. And I will point out that with the three major battlefields, in particular in our area, you've got Antietam from '62, with its vital link to the release of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. We have Gettysburg, where finally the Army of the Potomac got the leadership it deserved and decisively defeated Robert E. Lee. And then you've got Monocacy, which is no longer overlooked because of the great work that the Park Service has done and individual researchers have done, because of the extreme importance of the battlefield and the battle itself. And that's among the things we emphasize now when there are talks and programs done at Monocacy, is 1864, the war had changed so much, and the objectives of the war had changed so much. And not only was the ferocious battle that took place at Monocacy important, it was the significance of why that battle took place and the implications of it for the re-election of Abraham Lincoln and also the election that was going on in Maryland at the same time. So I think I couldn't agree with you more, Bill, because the portrayal of why these battles matter goes well beyond the military.
By the way, tomorrow being July 1st is the 162nd commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg's start.
Before we go, a point that you made, Steve, that we're becoming more and more conscious of the community has been the hospital. Even more so, the fact that the communities became a cemetery, and that had a real play on the community of Gettysburg and Antietam. I expect other battles as well. That it literally forced citizens away from the community for a while because of the stench and the difficulties of burying the dead.
Well, as you know, in One More War to Fight, I devoted a lot of attention to the development and controversy surrounding the National Cemetery at Antietam, and which ran right into reconciliation and who was going to be buried there and how and why. So, and these issues continue, as we've talked about, how one commemorates one's service, both on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and we've discussed those. So these issues, like so many issues in history, could not be more important now. And that's why understanding the history and expanding the scope of the types of things we address beyond the purely military, I think is very important, as you're pointing out.
I really appreciate what you do, Steve, and I admire what you do with going to the human element, to the personal element. And that is really, as a storyteller, I can say that's the essential element of telling a good story, is to concentrate on, especially when, in particular, or including when it comes to warfare. You know, the Red Badge of Courage, April Morning, Howard Fast, that's about the Revolutionary War, All's Quiet on the Western Front, Band of Brothers. It's all about the humanity. In order to get people to be interested in a subject, you have to tap into the humanity of the subject. So often, particularly with battles in classrooms, you've got the red line and the blue line, right? Or the red line and the gray line of where these different battle groups were. And that's really not very attractive. It doesn't suck in students. It's the human element that gets people to appreciate history and to understand what people go through. General Kane, in his presentation last week on what happened in the bombing of the Iran facility, where he talked about the individual soldiers who were doing different things. How do we get history, the teaching of history, back around to what it was when we were kids, when it really was, at least I grew up in Virginia, it was about the people who were involved? Well,
there are a lot of us, including me, who are out there doing this. And one of the things I did not mention the last time I was on, I'm not only on the faculty at Shepherd teaching young adults, I also am an instructor at Johns Hopkins teaching the other end of the demographic, where I teach people in their 70s and 80s in the Lifelong Learning Institute, which, by the way, is incredible to do both. And both of those groups, with decades differences in their ages, they both have the same type of thing you're talking about, the interest in hearing the individual stories. And this is, again, what I try and do and others try and do. I think that, for example, the talk I'm giving, and again, it'll be the same talk both days, so you can come either Saturday or Sunday. The reason why I'm focusing on Wallace and David Clendenin is because they were citizen soldiers. They were not professional soldiers. They became superb soldiers during the war. And they had never laid eyes on each other when they met literally the day before the first battle at north of Frederick on July 7th. And they had an instant understanding of each other because of what they had gone through during the war. Again, I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to preempt myself, but they both had tremendous adversity during the war from the command structure, and they had great difficulties, and there was question whether they would even remain in command. They were forged by war, and their leadership skills and their character and their belief in what the war was being fought for. Again, by 1864, this was a war of liberation, and they had great belief in that, and the views had changed, particularly with Lew Wallace. And what I'm going to talk about in particular is why these two men saw something in each other that led to success on the battlefield. They became lifelong friends. They both served in the commission that investigated the Lincoln conspiracy after the assassination. So these are the stories I choose to tell because that's exactly the point that both you and Bill are making, is that's how you hook people into history. And again, you as a best-selling mystery writer, and as you know, I've adapted that style with my narrative nonfiction. That's what the hook is, because to just stick strictly with the military, and some people love that. That there are a lot of people who do that. I'm looking for something else because my experience has been working with men and women who've been to war.
So, Steve, by 1864, a lot of people had gone through the Army. A lot of people had been killed. The things were feeling urgent on both sides. What was the level of training that someone like Wallace or Clendenin would have as citizen soldiers to go in and be officers? Oh,
those two were emblematic of the fact that the civilian volunteer, the citizen volunteer of 1861, by 1864, was a professional soldier to rival the finest in the world. And this has been fairly controversial when I've said this, because I've had some of the academic historians say, well, they were citizen soldiers, they became professionals. I've got great evidence. They considered themselves professionals. They compared themselves to the professional soldiers, not only in the United States, but in Europe. And don't forget, one of the most important things that occurred in 1864 was the tremendous reenlistment of the Union soldier. More than half of the veteran, battle-tested Union soldiers, white Union soldiers, reenlisted in 1864, which was the death knell for the Confederacy.
I have never heard that before.
Yeah, that was because of the Emancipation Proclamation, was it not?
That's a great point, Bill, because that was tied in. And by the way, I have a whole new talk that I do, and hopefully we'll talk about that the next time. I have a whole talk now which links the Lincoln re-election with the reenlistment of white Union troops. Not to mention the enlistment and, of course, wholesale enlistment of African-American troops that came alongside that. But you had the finest, most experienced Union troops whose enlistments were up in 1864. And yet, what Bruce Catton called one of the most amazing facts in American history, more than half of them re-enlisted when the war was at its deadliest. And they had survived 3 years, but they re-enlisted, knowing that the last year was going to be the worst.
Let's stop there. Just stop there just a second. Why, Steve? Why? And I thought you may have do you agree with the fact of the Emancipation Proclamation, or some other reason that they enlisted? But
no, absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Because when the Union soldier, the white Union soldier, who at that point there were very few African Americans who were going to vote in the '64 election, though some states African Americans could vote. They were voting by voting for the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, which they did overwhelmingly over the election of George McClellan. They were voting for two things, actually three things: that the war was going to continue, that slavery was going to be destroyed, and that African Americans were going to have rights they did not have before the war had started. They accepted all of that. Not only not only did they accept that, they advocated for this, which is why the election that abolished slavery in Maryland, alongside the federal election of 1864, is emblematic of the tremendous radicalization of the Union soldier, based on their military service, based on their commitment to what they were fighting for, and that's why they stayed in the ranks. And it's an amazing story, a very inspiring story. And they did that knowing that there was a chance they were not going to come home because the war had turned savage. There was no quarter given when African-American troops entered the armies of the Union because they and their officers fought under a death sentence imposed by the Confederacy, which was shown at Fort Pillow and at the Battle of the Crater and in other places. This was what they were undergoing, and they stayed in the ranks. And it's quite a story. So it's all these elements tied together. And again, with Wallace and Clendenin, they exemplified men with no military training. Although Wallace had served during the Mexican War but never saw combat, Clendenin was a teacher before the war, had no military experience. But they learned war, and they survived. And they had remarkable men serving under them. And again, Clendenin's case, the 8th Illinois Cavalry was considered by many to be the finest cavalry regiment in the Army of the Potomac. Wallace's men, for the most part, in the 8th Corps, were not experienced soldiers. Some of them had not been in combat before. Yet their performance on July 7th, through and north of Frederick, and the battle itself on the 9th, was remarkable, considering they were facing some of the finest troops in the Army of Northern Virginia with Jubal Early's corps, and they stood up against them, which is remarkable because nobody expected that.
You mentioned the Lincoln's reelection as a factor of reenlistment. I don't know if you get into speculative history at all. We've only got like 2 minutes left here, but if Lincoln had not been assassinated, what are the categories of what would be different? And how it's probably an hour-long lecture, but
yeah. I don't do speculative. I will say this, that my belief is that Reconstruction would have gone on as it did because, actually in one way, because the neutering of Andrew Johnson, particularly after his close acquittal in the Senate, it essentially became congressional Reconstruction. And one of the most important things, which again is one of the great themes I point out in One More War to Fight, is that the Union veteran was absolutely crucial to whatever success Reconstruction had and afterwards because of their belief that what they had fought for had to be carried on in civilian life by supporting African American equality. So that's as far as I'll go with speculation. I generally don't do speculation.
Let me drift away from the Civil War very quickly, but let me go to one of the principles. You mentioned Lew Wallace several times. And he wrote Ben-Hur, of course, one of the classics of all time. Did the Civil War provide the fodder for writing Ben-Hur?
Again, that's a great question. You have to figure it did, because Ben-Hur somehow survives the galleys, literally a death sentence, and becomes the great champion in the chariot races, which of course were lethal. You've got to figure. I've always thought that about Wallace, who, by the way, was a terrific writer. When you read his autobiography, even when you read his dispatches during the war, he was a terrific writer. But like so many who come through war, like Robert Graves, who wrote the great Goodbye to All That, about his experiences in World War I. That's why so many of the writers that we read, whether it's World War I, World War II, or the great Vietnam writers, you've got to figure that their experience deepens what they write about. And I can't imagine it wasn't the case with Lew Wallace.
We have 1 minute left. Dr. Stephen A. Goldman, our guest here. If you could, sir, publicize your appearance at Monocacy Battlefield July 12 and 13.
As far as I know, I'm going on at 2 o'clock, although that may be subject to change. I give the same talk both days in the content, but as always, you can do the same content and the the talks can be different. But there's going to be so many things going on. The Park Service does a wonderful job every year with the commemoration at Monocacy. There'll be demonstrations. I think both artillery and rifle fire. It should be a great event, and I'm so thrilled to be involved with it.
Good to have you on the program again, sir.
Always my pleasure.
Thanks, Steve. Enjoyed it very much.
Take care.